edition of our weekly webcasts. So today we are going to be talking about market entry, and we've got Jose, Semen, and Hassan here with us today. So at the end of the day, anytime that the act of entrepreneurship or innovation, it really is to expose these new innovations to the market. And we need to have a process or like an active process to make sure that we are entering a market. Many times, most of us are looking first at local markets. Nevertheless, the nature of the world today is that we can really be doing business globally, even as a completely new company with a small team. So we want to talk today about what it takes to enter a new market, especially when that market is not within your home country. So when we're thinking about entering these markets with these innovations, we need to consider the innovation ecosystem. So the innovation ecosystem is something that has been very well developed around MIT for the last, I don't know, I'd say, what would you say, Jose, what would you say are in terms of time?
Yeah.
Since when could we argue Boston has had an innovation ecosystem?
Well, it's had it for a long time, but I would say it has really exploded in certainly the last 20 years. That's when it really took off.
Right. One kind of interesting tidbit that I recently found out was that New Balance, the shoe company that Steve Jobs really liked, it actually has its headquarters in Boston.
Yep, it's a really nice building right outside of not too far, maybe just 5 kilometers, not even from MIT.
Right, and this company started almost 100 years ago, and the idea was it was a result of the research that was being done into petrochemicals at the time. And the two interesting industries that started around the same time was rubber tires and sneakers. And the rubber tires were much more durable for cars. And at that time, somebody came up with a great idea that, well, if these are durable and useful for cars, what if I put them in the bottom of my shoes, right? And so you could even have, for a longer time, and definitely outside of Boston, I guess, for the idea that innovations come out of a vacuum is not true. Innovations don't come out of a vacuum. They come out of ecosystems where you have certain fundamental ideas and institutions that then go on and, support for new industries to be started. And like Jose said, definitely, I think in the last 20 years, the innovation ecosystem in Boston has really, really fully flourished and become much more developed. So this is MIT's REAP Innovation Ecosystem Stakeholder Model. And these are the 5 different, you could say, institutions that it takes to have a healthy environment where new ideas can be introduced into the market. We've got entrepreneurs, universities, risk capital, government, and corporate players. So, Jose, another question for you. In this innovation ecosystem, who is the leader?
It depends because you have situations where the university comes up with some technology that then it's taken by some entrepreneur. So the university actually is the one that develops a technology and an entrepreneur licenses that technology. That happens quite often. Some cases you have a government funds, which are quite large, that are given to a university to do research on a particular area. And then the university makes some technological advancement or discovery, then that gets licensed. But actually the originator is government. And also, here we go, corporate. You can have a company, very large company that wants to solve certain problems or has certain challenges, and it goes to a university and says, here's $5 million. I'd like to investigate these topics. And then the university, works with that company. And then maybe they come up with a great innovation, but that is, maybe some innovation kind of like that is an offshoot of the investigation that's not necessarily of interest to the corporate, but you can license that, and the entrepreneur takes that licensing and does a startup out of it. So it can come from many directions. Where it might not come from is from risk capital, right? The people with the money are not necessarily pushing for technology. They're looking for technology primarily.
Right. Nevertheless, risk capital can hold some, they hold the keys to a very important door.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, and very often, especially in these areas that these clusters of technology, MIT, Silicon Valley, these the famous places, and the major cities, like so New York City is a big innovation area as well, but Paris and London, etc. The sources of capital, these venture funds or whatever, they very often get very much involved in the startup in terms of providing them with advice, because sometimes, or actually most of the time, these are not just, let's say, a financial person. They have technical people that are involved in the capital, in a venture fund, let's say, and they evaluate a startup, and they might actually even advise the startup and help direct the startup or redirect the startup if they think, you're doing something great, but we think it would be better if you did, this other direction. So the source of capital can be actually a source of guidance as well for the direction of a startup.
Right. I think that's and I think the point that you're making is really important, because it is true that investors should play a role, and they can play this big role in guidance. But I have seen many times entrepreneurs assume too much and rely too much on guidance from risk capital, and investors don't like that. Investors want to see that you have your idea. They don't want you coming to them asking them, what should I build?
No,
Right.
yeah. You can almost look at risk capital as a producer for an album, for a musician, right? The musician has the song, the musician has the talent, the voice, the instruments, say, for example. The producer helps direct that sound, maybe shapes that sound a little bit. But the artist, of course, there are some artists that are completely artificially made by the producers. But the real talent, they don't need the producer to produce music. They just need the producer to help them shape it, or to give it a specific sound that they're trying to find out.
Right. And connect them to the right kind of marketing and distribution channels, right? Which is, even if your music is great, it's not trivial. Good marketing talent can help you get a lot farther, a lot faster. So now about Korea, Sam and Hesan, who would you say is the leader in Korea?
Well, for me, I saw a lot of, well, definitely the government, I would say, from my experience, and the university, which is,
I agree.
which operate a lot of the funds that are provided by the government. Nevertheless, we see a lot of activity from the entrepreneur. But in terms of the funding that comes out, a lot is poured from the government down to university, risk capital, and then to the entrepreneurs, which sometimes might help, but in other cases where it's more, where the funds has to be more innovative, works on a model that is less innovative, if you know what I'm trying to say.
Right.
So we want to see a lot of movement coming from the entrepreneurs, right? Entrepreneurs leading the ecosystem, entrepreneurs actually telling the government, telling the university, telling the risk capital what they want to do and what they need to see happen.
And I think especially in the United States, or many times in Western countries, from entrepreneurs, there's a little bit of an idea that government doesn't matter. They shouldn't participate. We should always keep them at an arm's length away. And even though we could argue that people in Korea sometimes rely too much on the government, there's definitely a strong role for government to play in driving innovation, especially in some really difficult problems like healthcare and energy. You know,
Mhm.
we've seen with the coronavirus, because the government had a great response for leadership, this has opened the way for a lot of private companies in diagnostics and therapies and hospital supplies.
Right. Not to mention that a lot of regulations and a lot of resources that cannot be tapped by the private market is moving very quickly due to the government moving in a very fast way. I think that is a really good thing happening in the
Right.
ecosystem in Korea.
So Sam and Hessen, what do you see? So from my perspective, in the U.S. and especially in my area in Boston, the corporate role is one in which you have it's a certain corporation that will come to a university, but really in search of the startups, because the university usually focus on basic research, and the corporation is not necessarily interested in basic research. They're looking for something a little further ahead, something that's ready for market, and they basically want to kind of skip a few steps and get something that's already been massaged and developed and just about ready for market or entering market. And then they kind of will either do a pilot project with the startup, or they'll do a joint venture. And then if it's a really successful situation, the startup will either get a big investment from the corporation, or the corporation will buy out, of course, the startup. Do you see that pattern as well with Korean corporations?
I do see that pattern. From my experience, I did see that happening, but it is not that. So that's not the norm. What I see is the corporate investing directly in the university's R&D, research and development, and buying the core technology. The professors or the researchers are not doing a lot of spin-offs or not building startups. They're just licensing either the technology or getting funded to do the research itself. So it's more on the technology side rather than business. Yeah, go ahead, Tessa.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So, like Simon said, it's more like that. Then, it's more like they have technologies, but they tend to have. I saw a lot of startups saw that case that you mentioned, Jose. So I think that's why a lot of startups, they were trying to find corporate to work with, but it's not that easy for them to find a proper corporate, or to like if they, even though they find it, but they don't know how to like, it's so hard to deal with that they take advantage about it. So yeah, a lot of startups are like struggling to deal with the like the laws and how to balancing out the rules.
So, here's an interesting tidbit, Jose. I don't know if you know this, but Samsung owns a university in Korea. Did you know that?
I did not know that, but it does not surprise me.
And one of the reasons that they owned the university is that they wanted to enter the medical markets. And so they bought a university where they could fund their entire research system for medical technologies. And it's called Sungkyunkwan University. And this is not all that unfamiliar here. You have more than one. It's not just Sungkyunkwan. There's another university, Chungang University. It's owned by a construction company.
And so does that mean that if the university conducts research, that intellectual property belongs to the corporation?
No, not specifically. The foundation, the school foundation is owned by those specific companies. So I think that's not the case, but I would have to look more into it. Another thing that is happening is those major companies are actually contracting with specific departments within the university to secure talent way up ahead, and then have like research centers just focusing on the core development of technology, especially in semiconductors. So you have a specific department where a freshman goes in, they are in a track to go into that company.
Hmm. Okay.
So it's
So-
a conception like the university owns that that university, specific university.
Yep.
Mhm.
So now, understanding that different innovation ecosystems have a different makeup, when you want to enter a new market, we've got a pretty simple list of questions that can serve for you as a checklist to really think through the process and to understand what it is that you need to do when you go into the new market. And this checklist is going to follow these different stakeholders in this ecosystem. So first, starting with the entrepreneur, your team, your hipster, hacker, and hustler. The hipster, who is the person that builds empathy and designs, the hacker, the person who is building the product and applying and implementing the technology, and the hustler, the person who's in charge of bringing in resources, organizing those resources, and making sure that you're delivering value to the customers. Do we have the right team? And here, when it comes to the entrepreneurs, we want to be asking these simple questions of, is there anything else that I need, especially language-wise? Even though English is the language that you want to be using for business internationally, it's a pretty important question to understand to what extent do I need to localize my content, my materials, and my products.
And
Next,
also,
we've got-
also coming in, right? Coming from outside into Korea, same thing.
Right.
I just read a great book, Soul Man, which is about a American executive who worked for Hyundai. And
He gave a guest
came-
lecture when I was in my
Ah,
MBA program.
Okay,
Frank
Frank
Ahrens, yeah.
Ahrens. Frank Ahrens, yeah. So he comes in and he's like, "We're speaking a different language. I think we're speaking English, but we're not." You know, it's the cultural sometimes complete disconnect. So you think you can come in with a great company into Korea, and if you don't have a cultural perspective and a linguistic perspective, you could be, shooting yourself in the foot by not taking care of that piece.
Even to enter your own home country, once you start
sure.
working with teams from different disciplines, you can all have the same native language going into a market that shares that language, but you just don't have the working language to get things done. And this is something we've seen a lot with teams, right?
Yeah.
So once you add the actual language translation on top of the different disciplines, finding the right people really matters. I've seen this so many times and I think it's wrong. Oh, all I need is to find anybody that speaks English and Korean. Nope, you can't do that. You got to find someone that speaks the English that you need to be speaking and the Korean that they need to be speaking.
And very often a talent that's difficult to find, and even happens, I've seen it firsthand with English and Spanish, is to have somebody who speaks, reads, and writes English very well, and speaks, reads, and writes the other language very well. People say, "Oh, I speak Korean or I speak Spanish," and they can't write. That does happen quite a bit.
Right. And how do you evaluate this when you don't have those language skills within your team already? It's a little bit tricky. And I think that that's critical for entering a new market. Now, what about universities? So when I enter that market, do I need access to talent? If I don't have the right team, universities, do I want to be sourcing talent from there? Do I want to be sourcing technology? Am I in a situation where I want to go? And we're starting to see a little bit of this happening to Korea. People like Korean technology and they want to come here because they want to enter the market, not as an end user market, but as a technology sourcing market, so that then they can take this technology and sell it to other countries around the world. What about acceleration? There's a lot of accelerators, but university accelerators are great because they don't take equity. Sometimes they will charge you a tuition, sometimes they are free of charge. But they are a great focal point where you can, congregate and very quickly meet many of these other players in the startup ecosystem. So let's do, we were talking about from outside of Korea into Korea. Now let's talk about Koreans that want to go into the United States. Can they rely, for example, on MIT for acceleration? Jose, what do you think?
If it's a technology that is of interest, absolutely. It's really finding out where, what is the right fit. There's so many entities, like you could settle yourself down in, let's say, the Cambridge Innovation Center. You can go to Greentown Labs. These are places where startups kind of set up shop. So there's all different types. So really it's finding what's a good place to kind of find your group, your flavor, your community is kind of like an early stage exercise that you would have to do. Same thing with Silicon Valley, right? Who would you kind of target in order to get settled in that market?
And I think that point that you bring up is really interesting, that, if you want to get accelerated by MIT, you don't necessarily have to go to like the official tuition programs that MIT has. You can just go and get set up at the Cambridge Innovation Center, which is a co-working space that's right around MIT. And there are a lot of informal ways that you can get accelerated by being in very close contact with that community. Semin Hassan, how about informal acceleration? Is that possible in Korea? Do universities have, an open and informal networks that you can rely on?
Well, it's really hard if you are an outsider. There are programs, but most of the programs are happening for students and faculty, startups, alumni within the university. That's what mostly happens. If you are someone outside, you can still apply for the programs, and then if you get accepted, then you will have access to the university resources and acceleration.
Right. So that's one big difference between entering the market in the US and Korea. And it's something that we need to teach. We always need to, teach people a little bit about this key difference. Going from Korea to the United States, especially Boston, you can rely, and you really should rely so much more on informal networks. But the people coming from Boston into Korea, oh, I'm just gonna show up. Doesn't always work. You kind of need to have a formal participation in a network for people to feel comfortable taking a business meeting with you. Of course, that's changing, and LinkedIn is a great tool.
Yeah, it's changing. It's changing a lot because a lot of things are happening digitally too. So,
capital. Do I have enough money, or do I need local financing?
Or can I find a way to make money while I am working on the startup?
Yeah.
Or can the startup generate a side, kind of like the startup itself have a bit of a side hustle? I have a perfect example at North Shore Ventures, which is another accelerator or incubator in that Mario and I have visited, where it's all biotech, and there was one of the startups was using these little boxes with light in it to cause certain chemical reactions to take place. And the other startups were like, wow, that is really neat. I could really use those. So they started making them. They started 3D printing them. And it's a really simple box with light and a battery or a connector or something like that. But it's meant for laboratory use for very specific reactions that need light. And so they started selling them. And the startup is making money with a little side hustle, that helps them keep going without having to struggle to pay the everyday bills.
And I think that's an important lesson. A big mistake that we always see with entrepreneurs, especially those that don't have a lot of business, who's the first time trying business, they have a tendency to think, because I have a great idea, I will be able to get the capital. And then with that capital, with that money, I'll be able to execute on the idea. And the truth is that capital works the other way around. You've got to have the idea, start executing on the idea. This is going to sound silly, but sometimes get yourself in a position where you don't need the money, and then approach investors with a thesis of how you can grow or scale if you have access to their money. And so finding a side hustle, especially if this side hustle is maybe not the end product, but tangentially related, or sharing a common market, showing that you can sell into this market, and showing that you can survive within this market. Many times it's a prerequisite to get professional investors to then come on board and finance the fundamental technology, the fundamental product production, if it's like a very difficult technology product, or finance the market expansion. But it's very, very rare. No matter what, the stories and the movies tell you, it's actually quite rare to show up with nothing more than an idea. It does happen sometimes, of course, but it's quite rare to show up with nothing more than an idea and have professional investors just be like, oh, I love your passion. Here's $1 million, right? So the next one, government. This is a big trip up. Is my business legal? Just because your business is legal in your home country does not mean that it's legal in another country. Semin, what kind of things are illegal in Korea that we've found out?
Gambling.
Not beside that, recently Korean government banned Korean Uber. Yeah.
Well, it's
Uber
like
was legal, gambling is illegal.
yeah. Well, here in Massachusetts, and the same thing applies to California, there's a lot of activity around the marijuana business.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of businesses that are they're not related to the growing, they're related to data analytics. There's a lot of work on that, but it's and there is the medicinal market as well, which is more legal in even more markets. And yeah, you certainly don't.
Yeah, I hear it's a major felony, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, that's like an extremely
Yeah.
ridiculous mistake that somebody would make. But also, you have to understand that if you're going to enter a market, let's say you build a business in the United States, in the cannabis industry, which is a legal industry, and then you go to another market, you might have to be careful as to how much you disclose of what your other businesses are.
Mhm.
Because then some people might say, no, I don't want to work with anybody that I know you have your business in the United States, but I want nothing to do with that business, even though you're not doing that here in Korea.
Right.
I actually had the discussion with a company from Switzerland,
Mhm.
and the CTO deals with agriculture, and his solution probably worked very well in the marijuana industry. And I said, you should talk to people in the marijuana industry about that. And he said, no, I don't want to be involved in that business. So yeah.
And
You reminded me of a conference. Korea held a gaming conference.
Mhm.
And in this gaming conference, the government invited investors who are interested in investing in gaming companies in Korea. And I went there because I knew a couple of startups building games. And then I sat down with one of the investors. I like, so how are you finding the conference? And they're like, we found nobody. I'm like, what do you mean you found nobody? There's like a whole bunch of gaming companies in Korea. And he's like, oh, well, no, we do gaming like casino games. That's what we invest in. And as soon as we landed, we took the first meeting. We realized that they thought we invest in video games. We invest in casino games, and it's illegal. So anyways, the country's nice. And
Okay.
thanks for the, thanks to the government for the trip and the hotel stay.
Yeah. One last thing is not specifically for is my business legal in a big business category, but also like regulations.
Yep.
Or data and a lot of these things. Their regulatory status is different from here. If you want to collect private information, you can't have a server outside the state or something like that. It is a good thing to keep in mind.
And then, so the last question about the ecosystem is corporations. So do I need a local partner? Do I need access to distribution? Do I need access to development? In Korea, people come in and they're like, we want to work with Samsung. Okay, but Samsung is a huge company. Like, what exactly do you want to be doing with them? And is this the right time for you to be approaching them? And knowing and understanding that the group is a very unique group. As we said, they own a university. People know Samsung for its electronics, for its mobile phones, for its semiconductor. Samsung also owns a textile company. They have hotels, they have resorts. It's a they have an insurance company. They do life insurance. They build cars. Jose, did you know Samsung builds cars? Samsung is also a car maker. Um, it's a very large conglomerate, and I think it's also important for people to ask this question of, what do I want out of the corporate ecosystem, and what is the business that I'm proposing to them from a very practical perspective. I see so many times people say, "Oh, well, we're looking for business partners." All right, that's if what you're looking for could be true for every other company, then that means that your statement is a little bit too general. And you really have to narrow down and do research and what business unit and for what reasons do you want to be talking to these large corporations. So this is just like a pretty brief checklist of things that people need to be thinking about and questions that they need to consider anytime that they want to enter, a new market. We do have we do have one person. We've got a couple of questions in the we had a couple comments in the chat, so we are past the 20 minutes. We're at the 30-minute time now. We have one person observing. We have Giselle is here, so I would like to invite Giselle really quickly, and just have a very quick hi. Giselle, can you hear me? Hi, Giselle.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now. How are you
Okay.
doing?
I'm doing well.
So how did you find the presentation today? What did you think?
I liked the checklist approach. I liked it a lot. I found it very useful. I think I would like to do some more follow-up about how it could apply in different scenarios. And I liked how you were all able to provide examples about how that applied to the companies that you've worked with before.
So what kind of scenario do you think is interesting to you in terms of application?
I think for me right now, looking at how the role that universities play in this system that you showed in the very first slide, like seeing an idea and then that maybe like originated within a university and then seeing how it would be passed, how the different responsibilities would be passed through on like one idea.
And do you see among the people that you interact with and that are maybe thinking about starting a company or anything like that, do you see that they're more interested in doing work in the immediate vicinity, meaning like California in your case? Are they looking for something more like, let's say United States? Or is anybody considering international work and, kind of venturing outside because of a specific opportunity they see?
Well, I think with the one company that I have worked with so far, the one that I mentioned to you last time in San Francisco, the small startup, they had their sights first set on San Francisco and a couple other local cities in California, but then their expansion, they were looking towards other US states. So I haven't seen any international business efforts up close before.
I mean, that's one interesting thing about the United States is that depending on the type of product and depending on the type of industry, expanding to other states could be like expanding to a different country. For example, health insurance. Health insurance is bound by state lines. If you're a health insurance operator and you want to go to a different state, you've got to set everything up pretty much from scratch. You've got to go get your registration, your regulations, your compliance, and so the healthcare market within the United States is very heavily fragmented for that reason.
But that's a big opportunity right now because of COVID. There have been some big roadblocks broken with telemedicine. Because before, a doctor in Massachusetts, let's say a therapist or something, could not provide services to somebody in California. That has changed. And because there was such a shortage of doctors in certain geographical areas, it was like, no, well, we need a bunch of doctors in New York. And they don't need to be there in person, like let's say radiologists or social workers, therapists, and others, nutritionists, many others that can provide consultation virtually. That has been a big. Hopefully, it will accelerate that even more. And I even saw that, and I think I saw maybe on LinkedIn. for somebody from Korea who was talking about how it's telemedicine is not allowed. I don't know if that's correct, but that, you know, this is something that last year people would have been like, yeah, the same thing here, but all of a sudden it's like, boom, big change in just a matter of months.
I think for Korea, something similar is happening because telemedicine has been illegal. But now that especially COVID seems to be really rough on people that live farther away from cities, right? That don't have access to the same healthcare infrastructure, and and being able to get them some attention more quickly is important. So I know that I've seen in the newspaper that there's like discussions around breaking down those barriers, because they people who are most vulnerable are the ones that are at a disadvantage when these barriers to telemedicine exist. I mean, the other example, of course, where state by state it changes in the United States is with cannabis, right? The marijuana market, it really depends. And technically, it's not legal at the federal level. So a lot of companies are finding difficulty where, well, they can open in the state, but because banks are worried about what can happen at the federal level, they're having a hard time getting banking services. And that makes
So that's an opportunity for somebody.
right. Giselle, the company that you were working for, what was the product again? Remind me, please.
Oh yes, so they were a startup trying to develop an app for matching people with their vibes around this local city. So it was like a vibe map app.
Okay, so I think in that case there wouldn't necessarily be like big legal barriers for going from one state to the next.
But
Did
there
you
are there are potential privacy issues, right? Like are you identifying people? Do you submit basically an avatar and a username, and who has your data? Where is your data? If you go somewhere, is that tracked? Is there a record of that? There's a lot of issues that have to be taken into account that have to do with privacy and
And if you're a small startup, you can sometimes just, kind of get away with just running it. But eventually, if you do start reaching a scale, it does catch up with you. Um, you know, Interestingly about those things, what I've seen that a lot of startups is you got to find with the particular business that you have, which one of the states has the strictest law. So for example, for car emissions, California is the biggest market and they have the strictest emissions laws. So automakers just hit California standards and they use that to sell everywhere else in the United States. When it comes to privacy laws, I think California just passed a new strict law on privacy. Jose, do you know anything about that?
Yes. Geez, yeah, I remember reading up on that, but there's, I think you're right, but I don't recall exactly the details of that.
And I guess, Giselle, since you guys were based out of San Francisco, this is a natural advantage that a lot of California companies have, which is that since California in many aspects tends to have, plays a leading role in setting the standards that other states follow when it comes to consumer privacy, when it comes to environmental issues. If you guys fit your home state market, then you normally don't have a lot of difficulties in operating in other states. I know that something similar is true for education in Texas. So Texas is such a big state for education that the education industry has a really big tendency to follow, of course, curriculum at the national level, but, the state standards. And since most states follow, since many states follow the standards for education in Texas, then you got to kind of like match the regulatory standards for that state. And then you can use that as a basis to go to the rest of the country.
Now, Giselle, can I ask what are your interests? What are areas that would interest you to explore, whether it's for a startup or just your general interest? Because something that we have discussed in other sessions and webinars and meetings and calls is that the things that you enjoy, if you can work at them, that's like the perfect combination. And so, like, are there specific areas that you would want to be involved in because specifically they are very interesting to you?
Well, my two main interests have usually fallen around health policy and international relations. So I've been trying to find ways that combine those. I first started out with just an interest in science and biomedical science, but now I'm getting more interested into like the international relations field, and I'm right now looking for ways to combine them and maybe find something there.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Sure thing. And I wonder if COVID will change many of those things, especially as they relate to kind of analogous to the telemedicine issue among states or within one country like Korea. You know, whether we will reach a point where there'll be greater cooperation. I mean, there's going to be a big issue, I think, coming up if, depending on who develops the first vaccine, we could get into a situation where there will be a competition of sorts or rivalries of sorts, or you know, the United States government has not done a very good job of being very playing nice with the international community. So one fear is if a vaccine is developed internationally, let's say in China, will China say, well, we're not going to give it to the United States, we'll sell it to the Europeans? Or the US develops a vaccine and the US government says, first, we're going to deploy it here in the United States. You know, that you can get into some, to those two areas of interest of yours, you know, both health policy and international relations bundled into one.
Right.
Well, I think, Giselle, because you're at Minerva, right? You also have a really interesting opportunity over the next couple of years, because your program will actually be traveling internationally. So you'll definitely get an opportunity to, you know, look at these things at the ground level in the next few years as they are changing, right?
Yes, definitely. That's the goal.
Do you know what countries you're going to be visiting? Do you guys have your schedule set up already?
Yes, it's the same schedule. It's been set for a while now. So freshmen spend both semesters in San Francisco, and then sophomore year is split between Seoul and Hyderabad. And then junior year is Berlin and Buenos Aires. And then senior year is London and Taipei. So each semester, the cohort, your whole class gets up and changes residence halls. And then you stay in that location for the 4-month semester and immerse yourself in the city.
So you do both Seoul and Hyderabad, or you choose either one of those two?
You do Seoul first semester and then Hyderabad second semester.
Got it. Okay.
So the
That's
next semester is Seoul, right?
Yes, hopefully, if we're allowed to go.
Korea hasn't placed any travel restrictions. So entering the country shouldn't be a problem as long as you don't have restrictions to exit the country.
But is there still the quarantine restriction for foreigners? 2 weeks, right?
You got to come in and you got to stay indoors for 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And that one is pretty aggressively. So if you break that 2-week note, but it's not, you don't have to stay like quarantine in like a government facility or anything like that. It's just give us your address. You got to download an app to your phone, and they'll make if you leave, or you know, and there's heavy penalties if you leave your phone at home and then go outside. So there's something they're very strict with. But one fantastic thing about Korea is that they didn't place any travel restrictions at all. And they didn't retaliate, because everybody restricted travel to Koreans when we had the outbreak here, and the government didn't retaliate after the fact. They did slow down, and they do have some checks, but generally speaking, the country's been open. So that's interesting.
Well, given that structure, you know, the 2-week isolation, if you will, I could see an entity, you know, an organized trip, which is what Minerva would do, right? Would be like, okay, well, part of the semester is going to include that first 2 weeks is going to be, you know, kind of hunkering down.
Right.
There'll be activities that'll be completed, but you know, you have to realize you're not going to be able to go out and whatever. But you know, not too bad. 2 weeks is decent enough. It'll help get rid of jet lag, right?
Yeah. Out of all of the cities, I think Seoul is probably the best bet that we have right now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we look forward to seeing you around here, Giselle. That would be fun.
I look
Um,
forward to it as well.
Yeah, I have some pending trips to Seoul, and I have some pending trips to Hyderabad, and I have so maybe we'll catch up one of those.
Yep.
Yes, please do.
All right, cool. Well, Giselle, it's really good to see you. Jose, Semen, Hassan, thanks again for joining this week. Thanks again for the good discussion. And I'll see you again next Thursday for our next weekly webcast.
Okay.
All right,
Very
so I'll
good.
talk to you guys, all of you later. Take it easy. Have a good day in Korea. Have a good evening in Boston.
Okay. Bye bye.
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 Bye. Thank you.